Select the one sentence that best meets the requirements of standard written English. A. Governments are held responsible for the actions of their diplomats. They have a real incentive to monitor unsavory behavior and corruption. In this sentence, we find a comma separating two independent clauses, or two clauses that can grammatically stand on their own as sentences. In order to be considered an independent clause, each clause needs its own subject and predicate, which we see. The first subject is governments, with the predicate being are held responsible, while the second clause's subject is they, with the predicate being have a real incentive. Seeing as these two clauses are independent clauses, we need something stronger than a comma to separate the two. A period, semicolon, or an appropriate conjunction would all be viable options. But seeing as there's currently an error in this sentence, we can mark this choice as incorrect. B. Governments are held responsible for the actions of their diplomats, and they have a real incentive to monitor unsavory behavior and corruption. While it's true that this sentence uses a conjunction to join the two clauses, which we did say is an option, and isn't the best choice. Looking at the contents of our clauses, we can see that one actually explains the other. The reason that governments have a real incentive to monitor unsavory behavior and corruption is because governments are held responsible for the actions of their diplomats, and doesn't do enough to explain the connection between these two clauses. As this choice isn't necessarily grammatically incorrect, we'll keep an eye on it as we take a look at our other choices. C. Because governments are held responsible for the actions of their diplomats, they have a real incentive to monitor unsavory behavior and corruption. This sentence utilizes the advice we brought up with the last choice. It uses because to frame the sentence as having one clause explain the other. However, there's a different problem here. The sentence uses a semicolon. A semicolon connects two independent clauses, that is, two clauses that could grammatically stand on their own as sentences. While the second clause, they have a real incentive to monitor unsavory behavior and corruption, is an independent clause, the first is not. Because it starts with because, this phrase turns into a dependent clause. The phrase starts with because but doesn't actually finish and tell us what it's explaining. This being the case, we can see that the first clause is dependent and not independent, and therefore a semicolon is inappropriate in this context. This choice can be marked as incorrect. And D. Because governments are held responsible for the actions of their diplomats, they have a real incentive to monitor unsavory behavior and corruption. This choice incorporates both of the corrections we made with the past two choices. It uses because instead of and uses a comma instead of a semicolon, which is an appropriate punctuation choice to use to connect a dependent and independent clause. As this choice corrects the previous mistakes, we can go ahead and mark choice D as our final answer.